going to hand the mic over to Susan Shaheen. Susan is a dear friend of mine who has been a leader in transportation, mobility, shared mobility. She is an adjunct professor at the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. Through the center, she's championed development and deployment of technologies that deliver powerful and social environmental benefits. With that, Susan, if you could share your screen, and she's going to come on any second now. She's also an absolute rock star in mobility. So let's unmute Susan. There we go.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah.
Yep.
I think it's a tad bit delayed, you guys. So when you're watching these presentations, there does appear to be a bit of a delay. So I am absolutely delighted. I have been invited back for my third keynote by Jeffrey and the Ride Amigos family to CommuteCon. I'm really excited, and I'm very happy about the theme, which is really about finding purpose in shared mobility today. My talk is going to feature a lot of the work that we've done where we've found evidence of societal benefits. So I will be starting with a definition of shared mobility and talking about some of the societal benefits, both positive and negative, because not everything that shared mobility does is perfect, and that's the way the real world works. And I'm also going to end with a discussion of shared automated vehicles and questions that we need to keep in mind as we think about finding mobility with purpose. And then at the very end, I'll talk about some of our upcoming studies and our recent reports that have been released. So this is an ecosystem diagram that we put together with USDOT a few years ago, and this defines shared mobility as a very broad ecosystem that includes public transit, a lot of the core or incumbent services that you see on the left, and some of the more innovative services that you see right in blue. And that includes everything from bikes to cars to other types of modes. And it's all largely being facilitated on the right-hand side by information technology. And in the middle, what we see is a range of some of the more incumbent modes that are starting to have the infusion of more IT technology. But you can see that this ecosystem of shared mobility is quite broad. Okay. And in terms of impact, as I mentioned, when we think about societal good and finding purpose in our work, there's a lot of things to take into consideration when we do environmental assessment or a societal assessment of the impact of shared mobility. And our research has shown that we often see a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions, and we see this also coming about as a result of a reduction or a reliance on the private auto. Now, this isn't always the case across the population. What we do see, though, is the net effect thus far has often been in the positive direction. We also see people benefiting from having access to a car or to a bike on a short-term basis and only having to pay the marginal cost for that trip versus the fixed cost of auto ownership. And that provides a lot of benefits. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is as we move into more and more IT technology, that we don't leave critical populations that could benefit shared mobility behind, like low-income individuals, disabled individuals, elderly individuals, or even college. And I have a study that we're going to talk about a bit later regarding what we found there with college students. And then the overall total transportation effect. We're also really concerned about that in our research and understanding if we're reducing parking demand, if we're potentially adding to or removing congestion through higher occupant vehicles. This is the first study that I want to draw your attention to, and this is a study we did in concert with the Car2Go organization, and it was a 5-city study. We released it in 2016, and what you can see in this infographic is across these 5 cities and a fairly substantial population of individuals participating, that we saw everything from people on net selling vehicles or postponing a vehicle purchase. So you see anywhere from 2 to 5% reduction across the membership, a 7 to 10% reduction in postponement of vehicles, which was exceeding the vehicle sales, and then the total number of vehicles either sold or postponed due to a car-to-go vehicle, which is shown by 1 to 3 or 4 to 9 range. And then we also saw a range of VMT reductions and greenhouse gas reductions, which are indicated below. In the next slide, we show this by city. And one of the reasons I like to show this same exact infographic data in a different form is to show you that the cities make a difference. Their built environment, their populations, their accessibility to public transit makes a difference in terms of those net benefits to society in the way of getting cars off the road, VMT off the road, and greenhouse gas emissions off the road. And what you can see is that from Calgary all the way to Washington, D.C., there are net reductions, but they do vary by location. And I think the takeaway from this is that when we're thinking about bringing shared mobility concepts to our regions or our cities, they're not necessarily going to be generalizable results that come from highly aggregated studies, but that these differences do have an impact on what the effects of these types of systems can be on a community. And we're learning more and more about this with each year we do studies. This is bike sharing, and this was a study that we did across numerous countries in North America, Canada, the US, and Mexico. And this study was on the more traditional form of public bike sharing, which is station-based bike sharing, so not the dockless brand. And this idea also shows some societal benefits, but they varied by city and location as well. But the high notes of this is that about 5.5% of the individuals that were surveyed across these cities and nations said that they either sold or postponed a vehicle purchase to the tune of about 5.5%. About 58% increased cycling, and about 50% said that they reduced their personal driving. In terms of transit effects, they were mixed based on if we were in a more suburban location or in a city that had a less networked transit system. And in smaller cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, we saw that bike sharing was complementing public transit across the board. But in larger cities, what we saw was sometimes it was in competition with transit in those dense areas, but helping with peak shaving and extending the reach of the public transit system. But in more suburban and outlying locations, it really served as a first mile, last mile. So this moves to the next study, which is a Zipcar study, which some of you may have not seen the work that we completed with Zipcar in 2016. But we can see here from this slide is that we surveyed people across the North American marketplace, and Zipcar has a large presence throughout Canada and the US with college university car sharing, that we found that about 80% of university Zipsters did not own a car. 43% of them sold or put off buying a car, and about 40% said they were less likely to buy a car as a result of being members of shared mobility. There's some more societal effects that I think are really interesting to dive into. Well, we found that about 43% of the respondents to this survey said that they saved money on transportation due to Zipcar. We wanted to know, in terms of those savings, where were they putting that money? So some of them were buying more healthy groceries and food, and others were just saving money to participate in other types of activities that would enrich their lives. This is a quality of life scale, and what the key takeaways from this is that the majority of people were saying, because above 4 is a point above anything above a 4 is above neutral. And so the overall impact that was reported was close to 5 in terms of showing that Zipcar was changing the quality of life for people. And all the mean changes are positive as you look down this list. And what you see here is that accessibility, flexibility, privacy, freedom, access to nature and biodiversity, comfort, social justice, all of these factors were rating very, very high. In fact, all of them were. And that makes a big difference in people's lives who didn't have access to a car, or accessing a car might have cut into other aspects of their budget, like buying healthy food. This shows the distribution across the countries and across the two countries. And what you see here is that there's a substantial impact that is noticeable in the mountain, west-north central, and west-south central areas of the nation. And also up into Canada, we also see some notable figures as well in terms of those distributions. So again, bringing back this idea that aggregate level effects are interesting, but it's really important to think about the regions and the cities that we bring these concepts into and how those effects might be different. This shows the greenhouse gas emission effects, and you can see this ranges from a -1 to -5% reduction in VMT, greenhouse gases, from 0.1% to -2.6%. And you can see also here, when you look at the regional differences, that members at Southern and Canadian campuses have the greatest VMT reductions. And so that probably has a lot to do with their land use, their population densities in which these campuses are located, as well as their access to public transportation. So that's why these effects do start to show up as different in different regions of the US and Canada. So now I want to move us to this idea of the future of shared mobility. And this is a concept that we've been talking about for quite some time. And this is the idea that there's a convergence of everything from mobile and IT technology to automation and electrification and sharing. And Tim Pompandreo coined the term SECA, Shared Electric Connected and Automated Mobility, to represent this convergence back in 2016. There's a lot of possible opportunities for shared automated vehicle impacts, increased safety benefits, bringing up those vehicle occupancy levels, reducing per mile costs to individuals, unlocking urban space that is dedicated to parking, such as those parking lots inside apartment complexes or parking garages where we really may not need as much space in the future, and how could we convert them? How could we possibly downsize people's own privately owned fleets and ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future for everyone? Some challenges. Automation can also bring increased VMT by making it easier for people to travel. We might see more deadheading of vehicles to get people to those locations. So we have to keep all of this in mind, that we may be inducing more vehicle miles traveled because the costs are lower, but there may be more demand and there could be more deadheading. And we also have to be careful about vast modal shifts away from public transit. How do we create a more seamless system? And how do we make sure that we limit roaming zombie vehicles that are privately owned? So there's a lot to think about as we move into the future. Will people ultimately give up private ownership? It's still a question, because people might desire to move further away from urban areas, and we might have even more sprawling land uses as a result, because people can now sleep and work or exercise in their car. And ultimately, will this end congestion? So we have lots to think about, and public policy is going to have to get into this, as well as a very thoughtful planning process. So there's going to be a need for public policy, as I mentioned. We think that there's going to be a lot of emphasis on increasing higher passenger occupancy levels, enhancing accessibility so people can cross that digital and income divide. We think it's very important that policy focus on reducing congestion and on greenhouse gas emission and environmental sustainability, and leveraging pricing to manage that demand is going to be probably a very big part of this, managing access to that curb and to that roadway space. So with that, I want to wrap up my comments for today. Just let you know that if you're interested in subscribing to our latest updates, we have a weekly newsletter, and we also post all of our reports. You can subscribe here, as you can see. We have a series of recent reports, including one that you may have not seen in orange there on shared mobility and transportation equity. I really want to highlight that one because it's the latest in the series and super relevant to the conversation today about social purpose. And also another new report, Mobility on Demand, that is the Concept of Operations report recently completed by the US DOT and Planning for Shared Mobility. Okay, it's not letting me advance the slides at this point. I'm not quite sure why, but I believe we're to the book. That's also available, Disrupting Mobility, co-edited, and here we end with acknowledgments. Just want to acknowledge all of the people that support our work at TSRC, including all of you. And thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Susan. And we want to try to stay on schedule here, but I do have one quick question that I can answer very quickly. Is either the quality of life tool or the raw data from those studies available publicly or to other researchers?
Right, the quality of life scaling tool is going to be published along with that report. We did not include that in the white paper that is currently available, and we have not discussed with Zipcar whether or not those data could be publicly available. Our data agreement does not include publicly accessible data at present.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Great to have you with us, and hope to see you at CommuteCon next year.
Great. Thanks so much.